Okay, friends, I'll take maybe about 75 minutes to present the paper which I have already written. Eco-philosophy is a very wide subject. So to attempt to talk about it in 75 or 90 minutes is a difficult task, but I'll try and have an overview of eco-philosophy in these 75 to 90 minutes. I'll certainly stop before 90 minutes so that we can have some questions. Also, I would like to close the session at 5 p.m. if you don't mind. So let's start with what is this eco-philosophy? I would say eco-philosophy has been there ever since humans existed on this. Even though some of the branches of eco-philosophy emphasize a lot about non-human beings. In fact, the presence of humans is what makes environment an important issue. Without humans, environment is not at all an important issue because animals are not environmentalists or plants are not environmentalists. So ever since human existence on this earth, humans have thought about the environment because they realize that it is the material basis for their survival, for their subsistence. So since then, thinking about nature in some form or the other, initially it may have been like pantheism. You worship everything around you because you don't want them to harm you, or you worship the soil, you worship the earth. So it must have been in some pantheistic form in ancient days, but nevertheless, in some form or the other, man has thought about man. I'm not using it in a gender thing. When I say man, please understand women are involved in it, included in it. So humans have, I would rather use it than humans. Humans have always thought of the environment. But what happened over time is that uh, ever since the advent of industrial civilization in the 18th and then 19th centuries, it started growing. Even though it began in the 18th century, industrial civilization became a major force in the 19th century. So since then, human attitudes to nature and because even when some people would say that even agriculture was not nature friendly, I do not subscribe to that view because agriculture was, in that sense, the beginning of civilization. Without agriculture and the surplus generated through agriculture, we wouldn't have had the modern civilization which exists today. Agriculture had a pastoral nature vision, and the old agricultural technology or old agricultural implements didn't have the capacity to alter the environment or the surroundings in any major way. So the real changes started happening after the industrial revolution when we brought new energy forms like coal under our command. First coal, then later in the second half of the 19th century, oil was brought under human command, and oil became a major force in the beginning of the 20th century. Not exactly, actually, after 1930, when and up to between 30 and 1945-50, when the Persian Gulf, there were major discoveries of oil in the Persian Gulf. That is when oil really started flowing around the world. Before that, it was limited to certain parts of the world, like the United States, Russia, etc. So when we brought these new forms of fossil energy under our command, it was a mutually reinforcing mechanism. These fossil energies opened up the possibility of more mining. I mean, we started mining metals and minerals more and more, and then we started building more and more machines. First, the steam engine, and then it triggered the building of more and more machines. So the industrial revolution changed human approach to nature from a provider of subsistence or livelihood to a source of profit or a source of commerce. That was a major change. In this process, what happened was humans started becoming a major geological force. Generally, the Earth has major sources, geological sources like there are volcanic eruptions, there are cyclones, there are many natural forces which can overwhelm life on Earth. But humans started becoming a much bigger force than these geological forces. That is what happened in the 20th century with the phenomenal growth of industrial civilization and industrialization and the technologies associated with industrialism. I'm not talking against industrialization. I'm saying that the concept of industrialism, the idea behind industrialism, exploiting everything around us for the sake of profit, that took a major toll on the environment and Earth. So that is why in starting 2000, geologists and scientists, especially in Europe, started discussing the possibility of renaming our era. We live in what is called Holocene. Our geologic era is called as Holocene, which is after the last, ice age, after the advent of agriculture. Our age is called the Holocene. So scientists and geologists started talking about renaming the Holocene as Anthropocene. They started talking in 2000, and 2016, they made a formal proposal to the International Stratigraphy Commission to rename our era, or geologic era, as the Anthropocene. So Anthropocene, it's yet to be formally approved, but if you look at the internet, Anthropocene today is a major concept in the world. I mean, especially in literature, it's discussed quite a lot. In science, it is discussed. So we are actually living in the Anthropocene. But another group of left-oriented thinkers and scientists have contested this terminology, saying that it's not exactly by attributing the name Anthropocene, we are putting all the responsibility on humans, a subjective kind of agency called humans. Actually, who is responsible for this destruction? Is it humanity as a whole? In fact, if you look at the climate change phenomenon, which is becoming a tragedy across the world, especially this year, we are seeing all over the world huge disasters because of climate change. Even as we are talking, there are major events happening in Canada and many places around the country. In India, for example, in Andhra Pradesh, Kerala is going through it. In fact, the whole of peninsular India has suffered significantly in the last few months because of natural disasters. Not just peninsular India, even in the northern India it has happened. In Europe it has happened. In fact, 2021 has been a year of perhaps a year in the history, Earth's history, known history, I mean to say. Earlier in Paleolithic times, of course, there were major events which had resulted in major changes in the Earth's environment and atmosphere. But in non-disastrous year, with natural disasters happening all over the world. Canada, in fact, famous city Vancouver was completely cut off from other parts of Canada by floods. And 2 days after the major flood in Vancouver, that province of Canada, that is British Columbia, there is a heavy snowing happening there. So climate has gone haywire completely. And there is an argument that about 90 corporations in the world are responsible for all the pollution, all the carbon dioxide emissions, which have created this climate change in the world. I mean, just briefly, I'll tell you that carbon dioxide is present in Earth's atmosphere in less than 0.4% of the Earth's atmosphere is constituted of carbon dioxide. But that concentration has been increasing after the industrial revolution. And before industrial revolution, we had what is called 280 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Today, it is about 413 parts per million, which is about almost 50% increase. Not 50, let's say 47% increase since the industrial revolution. So there is an argument that Anthropocene, we should call it Capitalocene, because the main reason for this is the the culture of capital, and the culture of making money by investing. So that's an argument. You can contest it. So these two arguments do prevail. So we live in a new age where humans have become a major geological force. So environmental philosophy or eco-philosophy, as some people call it, has become extremely important. It has to become a kind of cultural fabric world over if we have to grow out of this tragedy which we have landed ourselves. Because ultimately, human thinking, human culture, what we think and what we do out of our ideas, when we practice and put our ideas into practice, that is how things happen in the world. So unless a new awareness, a new thinking becomes the fabric of our culture all across the world, you can have different versions of it depending on your ideological preferences. You can have different, what we call generally, there is a new term called pluriverse. So this is not a monolithic world. You can have a pluriverse where different ideas, different systems, different governance structures, different societal structures exist. So that is how eco-philosophy has become extremely important. And in the last, since I follow it almost on a daily basis, in the last 20 years especially, eco-philosophy started growing in the 1970s, but today it has become a major branch of philosophy. In fact, perhaps the most discussed philosophy in the world. So just going back, why is it that you know most people are religious in the world? There is a minority, maybe I don't know how much percentage, I can't say, who are atheistic, who don't believe in God, but most people are religious, and all the religions generally are infused with nature vision, vision about nature. I mean, especially you look at Indian Hinduism. The Hindu religion is perhaps the most environmentally aware religion in the world, and it's one of the oldest in the world. So without going into detail, I would just talk about chapter 12 of Atharva Veda. I mean, maximum environmental awareness and vision is in the Vedas. There are, of course, in the Upanishads, in the Vedas, and a lot has been written about the environmental vision in the Vedas. There are so many books on the subject. I just want to quote two verses from chapter 12 of Atharva Veda, which is called Bhumi Suktam or Kruti Sukta in Hindi. I would just quote verse 2 and verse 35. I have to read it out. So, verse 2 first. May this earth, whose surface undulates with many gradients and sustains an abundant variety of herbs and plants of different potencies and qualities, support all human beings in all their diversity of endowment in mutually supportive harmony and prosperity. A very, very concise and very evocative way of thinking about nature. Then, of course, about human interaction, the human metabolism with nature. The Bhumi Suktam verse 35 says, "O pure earth, may that we utilize your soil well for creative production without causing you injury." A very critical observation. Or harm, without causing you injury or harm and disturbing any vital element in you. So Bhumi Suktam is perhaps one of the oldest environmental philosophies to be articulated in this world after the religions, after different religions came into existence. And Hinduism, is, all of us know, is one of the oldest religions in the world, perhaps the oldest. Then, of course, the offshoots, please don't take offense if there are Buddhists and Jains or Sikhs in this group. When I'm saying these three are Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism are offshoots, I'm not denying their independent existence. I'm just saying they branched off from Hinduism and established their own philosophical and religious practices and scriptures. Buddhist, I would just talk about Buddhism because it's probably the most environmentally aware religious system outside of Hinduism. And there, Christopher Titmuss, in his famous book on the Green Buddha, he says time and again the Buddha referred to environmental life to illustrate a wise way of living. As we undergo transformation ourselves, that's why in eco-criticism also there is a feeling, there is a saying that first we have to transform ourselves. Then our actions are transformed. Then our approach to nature is transformed. So time and again, Buddha referred to environmental life to illustrate a wise way of living. As we undergo transformation ourselves, so does the world in the way that we perceive and respond to. Taoism also, that is Chinese philosophy, is also nature-centric. And Buddhism's through the four tenets, I would say love, compassion, spiritual joy, and equanimity. These are the four major tenets of Buddhism. Love and compassion involves love and compassion for nature, everything around you, animals, nature. And it's also about mindfulness of all beings, not just about ourselves. There is this Western saying that is the Baconian tradition. They say, I think, therefore I am. So you move out of that Baconian kind of precept, and then you are mindful about all beings on earth. And joy involves experience of joy through contact with nature. So that is why Buddhism, after Hinduism, perhaps Buddhism is the most religious tradition in the world. The Judeo-Christian tradition, the Jews and the Christians, Christianity and Islam, we know are basically offshoots from the Jewish tradition, and their scriptures are also based on Jewish scriptures. So the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is a conventional saying that they are anti-nature or they are anthropocentric. And in 1967, Lynn White published a paper reinforcing this conventional thinking. This paper was called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And Lynn White argued that Judeo-Christian anthropocentrism stripped nature of its sacred status and exposed it to human exploitation and control. In fact, there is one view that Christian anthropocentric belief. So, however, there has been a green tradition within Christianity. In the last few decades, this green tradition within Christianity has been articulated very strongly, especially somebody like Saint Francis of Assisi. I mean, there is something like Saint Francis did not write it. Chronicles of the Canticles of the Sun. That is, he's supposed to have uttered this kind of long poem, or various times what he spoke about nature and all. Canticles of the Sun, it has been translated, it's available in English. So his tradition, Saint Francis of Assisi, was a very nature-centric Christian evangelist and preacher. And surprisingly, a 12th century Catholic nun, Hildegard von Bingen. I have written about Hildegard's works. In fact, I have her works translated. 4 or 5 of her works I have translated in English. So these two are kind of the green Christian saints, and there is the whole green theology developed out of this green tradition within the Bible. So the Bible is being read now because Christ himself was not, he was not anthropocentric or anything. What happened in the growth of Christianity was that they eviscerated, they destroyed all the remnants or all the remnants of paganism and pre-religious traditions, because they wanted to grow Christianity. In fact, there has been very gruesome events which happened in Europe about killing of birds, cutting of trees. There are major events like that. So leaving all this behind, now a green tradition or green theology has been developed within the Christian tradition. And in fact, in Latin America, it has grown into a green liberation theology. And the liberation theology was mostly developed in Latin America, even though the first guru of liberation theology is an African priest. It grew mostly in Latin America. So there is this strong tradition of green theology within Christianity. So it is Islam also. There are now you can get books about nature vision in Islam. Uh, so it's basically speaking, all religions have in some form or the other. They had definitive vision about nature and the environment around us. Now, leaving that period behind us, let's come to the modern era, let's say the post-enlightenment, Western enlightenment, I mean to say, because enlightenment was not the monopoly of the Westerners. We also had our enlightenment periods in our traditions. So when I'm talking enlightenment, please understand it's about the Western enlightenment and the post-Western enlightenment period. There's one philosopher who is an environment. He is perhaps the only enlightenment philosopher who spoke against the current of Western enlightenment and stood with nature. I'm talking of Rousseau, yeah, Jean Jacques Rousseau, is a French philosopher you all know about. Rousseau, I would consider as the patron saint of ecology. Um, uh, then, of course, Thoreau was there in the 18th century. I mean, in America, you all know because his book Walden is very famous. Of course, there are other very interesting writings of Thoreau, like the natural history essays, especially when I say about the walking, which is included in natural history essays. So Thoreau in 18th century America, Rousseau in 18th century Europe, that is France, and John Ruskin in 19th century actually. He was the contemporary of J.S. Mill and all in England. So these three could be considered patron saints of modern ecological or environmental philosophy. Rousseau, in his major treatise, was Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Rousseau considered because he was, you could say, he was one of the first left of center philosophers in Europe. Not first exactly, but among the Enlightenment philosophers, he was probably the first left of center kind of philosopher. And he said that the system of private property is the basic reason for human alienation from nature. When you started owning land, you started owning nature. Before that, man lived in nature, even though he was doing agriculture, but we were mostly practicing shifting agriculture. You know, people were clearing some forest because the earth at that time, at that point of time, more than 75% was forested. So a lot of people lived within forests. They used to clear a small patch of the forest, cultivate it, move on. So the moving kind of migrant population living in forests. But when you started owning property, you start settling down for agriculture in that property which you enclosed. The enclosure movement, enclosing property, that is what Rousseau says was the basic reason. It is his view. We need not, or you need not agree with that. In this discourse on origin of inequality, he ends towards the end of that discourse. He talks about, he eulogizes actually the concept of noble savage, man as noble savage. Many people have misinterpreted this concept, saying that Rousseau is a primitivist. Actually, he's not. He is not at all a primitivist philosopher. Noble savage is the kind of wildness, the connection with nature which man has to maintain. Nature inside you, wildness in. I mean, in fact, if you look at human system, our body, it's perhaps the most wild ecosystem on this earth. It's much more complex than the natural ecosystem. You know, the nature. Those of you who have studied some ecology know the nature is an extremely complex system with at least a dozen major natural biogeochemical cycles operating unseen, and that is what we disturb through our economic activities. So this natural biogeochemical cycles operating in nature makes it a very complex process, and it is unseen. So very often ecological arguments, you cannot show people what is happening. You know, like when a disaster happens, you can show. But the silent ecological complexities happening within this natural biogeochemical cycles. You cannot show it to someone. That's why most people are perhaps not aware of ecology because you're all busy with your life. You have no time to sit and think about it anyway. So when Rousseau talked about a noble savage, he was talking about man in thinking and living in consonance with nature, not about primitives. Then came Ruskin. Ruskin actually mainly he was an art critic. You all must have, those of you who are doing literature knows his famous work of criticism called Modern Painters. I think it is in 4 volumes. It was basically an art critic who turned to social criticism later in his life. And the reason for turning is he despised John Stuart Mill's economic philosophy. John Stuart Mill, as we know, after Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, John Stuart Mill was one of the major economists in the 19th century. You know, he wrote on the political economy, his famous treatise on political economy. So what Ruskin did was to refute J.S. Mill's theories. And Ruskin, in 1857, Ruskin delivered a series of lectures called The Political Economy of Art. And that was his turning point. That has now been published in book form as A Joy Forever, even though originally he had titled it as The Political Economy of Art. He talked about that, refuting the concept of economic man evolved by Adam Smith and J.S. Mill. He refuted that concept of the economic man. And he said, it is not competition which is important in life, but it is cooperation. That was a fundamental tenet of Ruskin's criticism. And his very famous work, Unto This Last, has been a major influence on Mahatma Gandhi. You all know that. I will come to Gandhi a little later. So Ruskin concluded to put his philosophy in a few words, he said, there is no wealth but life. That was a refutation of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and J.S. Mill's talk about political economy and capitalism. So there is no wealth but life. That is how John Ruskin refuted the economic philosophy of major philosophers like Adam Smith and J.S. Mill. Yes. Then comes Thoreau. When we talk of Thoreau, we have to talk about his mentor, Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson, very famous American philosopher. In fact, Thoreau was mentored by him, and Thoreau used to borrow a lot of books from Emerson's library. And Emerson was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy, especially the Hindu philosophy. And Emerson had a metaphysical kind of transcendental philosophy. Even though Thoreau was Thoreau, actually it's pronounced as Thoreau. In Malayalam people write as Thoreau, but I think it's a French word, so it has to be pronounced as Thoreau. So Thoreau, when he went to live in Concord, forest of Concord, after which he wrote Walden based on his experience in Concord, near the Concord Pond. Thoreau moved away from Emerson's influence. Thoreau started talking about wildness, something akin to Ruskin's Noble Savage, frankly speaking. He talked about the wildness in human beings, the wildness in nature, and these two are connected. And mind you, Thoreau was also influenced by Indian philosophy. And in fact, he used to read the Bhagavad Gita. One of the books he kept in Concord when he was living in Concord in the forest was Gita, actually. He used to read Bhagavad Gita. So he was influenced, and in turn, again, I'm coming back to Mahatma Gandhi. We'll be talking about it later. Thoreau also, Ruskin and Thoreau were major influences on Mahatma Ji. So Thoreau believed in sustaining the wildness in human and nature. In fact, this concept he extended to literature also. That's why, because this is a seminar on national seminar on ecocentrism also. I have attended the first global conference on eco-criticism 95 in the United States, in Colorado State University. So I found, and after subsequent readings of American eco-criticism, mostly American eco-criticism is founded on Thoreauvian thinking. The foundation is Thoreau's philosophy. That's how American most eco-critics, especially famous eco-critics like Lawrence Buell, uh, their thinking is based on the Thoreauvian tradition. Anyway, so Thoreau, in fact, this is applicable to our epics. For example, you think of Ramayana. You all say that Ramayana is written by Valmiki, was a forest dweller. Malayalam will say Katalan. So he was a forest dweller, but what was he? It was the wildness in him, which was the source of his creative strength. Ramayana. Even Mahabharata, when Vyasa wrote it, he was in a completely different environment. He was not exactly in a forest meditating when he was supposed to have written Mahabharata. So it is the wildness which is a source of creativity. And in modern times, Claude Lévi-Strauss has talked about the same thing when he said about the raw and the uncooked. He's talked about. So this rawness in us. So when you are tamed, and cultural taming and taming by human laws, human society, then you use that wildness. That's why most writers have to lead a life where they have a little freedom from, not a little, a lot more freedom from the bindings of the society around them. That's why many of them become recluses. Writers become recluses because that is the source of their creativity. So, very interesting sentence of a few sentences of Thoreau I want to read out. He says that the true man of science will know nature better by his finer organization. He will smell, taste, see, hear, feel better than other men. He will be a deeper and finer, his will be a deeper and finer experience. We do not learn by inference and deduction and the application of mathematics to philosophy, but by direct intercourse and sympathy. It is with science as with ethics. We cannot know the truth by contrivance and method. The Baconian is as false as any other. Thoreau wrote. I think this is from his essay, Walking. In the United States, people like conservation and preservation both. Aldo Leopold, John Muir, George Perkins, all these people basically developed their philosophy based on Thoreau's tradition. Then Lawrence Buell, I mentioned about him a little earlier, a major eco-critic in the United States. He said, he quoted actually Thoreau's, this sentence of Thoreau's, in literature, it's only the wild that attracts us. That's again from same essay, Walking. So Lawrence Buell emphasizes Thoreau's literary significance and says that to read Thoreau in the light of his expanded conception of environmental intertext is at once to redefine the cultural significance and to help revise our understanding of what counts as the American environmental imagination. Now we'll come to Gandhi. As I already mentioned, Gandhi was certainly influenced a lot by the philosophical tradition. He was very much influenced by that, but because of his Western education, he was educated in England. Because of his Western education, he was a very interesting product of an East-West synthesis. So he was influenced by Ruskin and was influenced by Thoreau. In fact, when in the 150th year of publication of Thoreau's Walden, the Thoreau Society in America published a sesquicentennial volume of their journal called Concord Saunterer. They asked me to write on Thoreau and India. So it was in 2004. That was the sesquicentennial year of Walden. I had written a small piece on Thoreau and India. When I went into how Thoreau influenced India or India influenced Thoreau. So Gandhi is especially Gandhi's concept of satyagraha was a derivative from Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil obedience. In fact, Thoreau had protested against some tax increases in his province, and he was arrested and jailed, I think, for a day only, but he was in jail. So that was the kind of peaceful resistance which Thoreau articulated in his essay on the duty of civil disobedience. And Gandhi himself has written that this idea of satyagraha owes a lot to this Thoreauvian essay. Similarly, Ruskin and Tolstoy had influenced Mahatma. And Gandhi did not write anything called eco-philosophy, but everything he wrote was perhaps relevant for eco-philosophy, because his vision about, he was more intuitive. I mean, he was scholarly. He's read quite a bit because of his Western education. He's read about the Western tradition. He read about non-Hindu religious traditions, lived in Africa. But beyond all that, his writings are suffused with his intuitive wisdom. That's what we should live. He did not think for, say, next 50 years. He thought for eternity. I mean, his thinking was like, what will happen to the world, say, 100 years hence or 150 years hence? So his thinking is now, there's a lot of writing coming out about his thinking and how in the 21st century there is going to be a resurgence of Gandhian thinking. He thought about a decentralized, village-oriented and nature-friendly development as against the mass production orientation of capitalism. So, and Thoreau's very famous maxim, he said simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. It's the same with Gandhi. He talked about simplicity in life, not complicating life with industrialism. And the main thing Gandhi visualized that industrialism, it's not again industrial industry as such. Industrialism, he said, has no long-term future. But he said, I am not against industry as such. So I will read out this quotation from his essay, The Curse of Industrialism, which he wrote in the Harijan on 1st of September 1946. I'll read it out because that makes Gandhi's vision very clear. I would categorically state my conviction that the mania for mass production is responsible for the world crisis. When production and consumption both become localized, he spoke, about a decentralized, village-oriented production system. That did not rule out cities. Okay, there could be small cities also, but he was against major urbanization. Okay, consumption both become localized. The temptation to speed up production indefinitely and at any price. Machinery has its place. It has come to stay, but it must not be allowed to displace necessary human labor. That's happening today. What he visualized, that machinery replacing human labor, is happening in a big way today because of automation, that is the digital automation. And robotization is going to displace a lot of human labor in a few decades. And it has accelerated during the pandemic because people were not able to reach work spots. The automation has increased in a major way. There's no time to go into all that, so I will brief. So he was concerned about displacement of human labor. Then he said, I refuse to be dazzled by the seeming triumph of machinery. I am uncompromisingly against all destructive. To stress that point, he spoke against destructive machinery, not against machinery per se. At the same time, I believe that some key industries are necessary. So Gandhi's was a very highly intuitive philosophy, thinking long-term, not just about India, even though he mostly wrote about India, starting from Hind Swaraj, which he wrote in 1909. Before he came to India, he came to India in 1914. In 1909, when he was traveling from England back to South Africa, he was in a ship for 24 days. He wrote Hind Swaraj during those 24 days. First wrote in Gujarati, later translated into English. So then, of course, I mean, Gandhi's volumes, actually, total writing comes to 90 plus volumes, which has been published by National Book Trust, you all know about that. So then there are, of course, other philosophers like James Lovelock's Gaia theory. There's so many such philosophies which are akin to eco-philosophy, but I have no time to go into it. So I basically briefly present. Uh, I've taken 40 minutes already, I think. So I'll speak about 4 branches of eco-philosophy, which are the major eco-philosophical branches. Deep ecology, first course, first modern eco-philosophical stream to come into existence. Then environmental ethics, which is sort of, you cannot call it, it pervades many eco-philosophies, but at the same time, it has its own standing as eco-philosophical vision. Then ecofeminism, which again is not a monolithic tradition. I think Dr. Jancy James is speaking tomorrow something on that topic. Ecofeminism, mind you, is not again a monolithic philosophical iteration. It has different iterations within it. Then, of course, eco-socialism is something which developed from the 80s onwards, but came on its own. Came to gained a lot of philosophical strength beginning with around 1999, 2000. Began around 1980, or before that, even in the 70s, there have been publications. I'll talk about that when I come to ecosystems. So deep ecology, actually, the founding document of deep ecology was an essay by Arnes. I've given the reference number 20 in the reference list of my paper which I've written. In 73, he spoke about, Arnes is a Norwegian philosopher, you must all be knowing. He talked about the distinction between shallow ecology and deep ecology. What by shallow ecology, what he meant was the kind of Western environmentalism, where you are interested only in human welfare, so you want to control pollution and things like that. He called it shallow ecology, and he called his philosophy ecosophy. In this essay. In this essay, he talked about 7 basic tenets of his ecosophy. One is that the rejection of man in the environment. He rejected man in the environment, basically. He rejected anthropocentrism in favor of a relational and total field image of man, a kind of biospherical human. That was his first principle. Second was he talked about a biospherical egalitarianism. In a way, he was actually rejecting the socialist concept of egalitarianism because one of the later precepts I'll come to later, he rejected the caste distinctions. So he spoke about biospherical egalitarianism, which is equality for all living beings on earth, not just humans. The third precept he talked about was the principle of diversity and symbiosis. It's fine because the concept of diversity, even biodiversity, human diversity, cultural diversity, all that is important for peaceful existence in the world. He said the essence is a live and let be principle rather than the antagonistic view of either you or me. That was his precept of diversity and symbiosis. And then he was against a class division, anti-class stance. He rejected the class stance of socialist school. Then he said we should continue the fight against pollution, resource depletion, but go beyond that based on the other principles he has enunciated. Then he spoke about the most controversial of his 7 precepts was this, about complexity, not complication. I have to read it out because then only we will understand why it came for major criticism. The astoundingly high level of complexity of living organisms, ways of life, and biospherical interactions is not fully comprehensible to humans and till now it's fine, and makes thinking in terms of vast systems inevitable. This is also fine. He's bringing in actually the systems theory here. But the next sentence is the problem. The complexity, not complication precept, favors division of labor, which could be interpreted as reinforcement of a very regressive concept of division of labor. It can be interpreted to justify caste, for example, and not fragmentation of labor. It seeks more sensitivity towards continuity and life tradition. Now, again, this tradition could be, bringing back traditions could be interpreted as being very regressive. Not, no, we should not be against traditions, but at the same time, this can bring back stereotypes. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation for people who want to be very conservative. In the realm of technology, Nays favored soft techniques. What he calls soft techniques is probably appropriate because people like Schumacher has spoken about, appropriate technology, something similar, the soft technique of unemployment. And then the last precept was local autonomy and decentralization. This, I think, nobody should have any quarrel about, because even the socialistic philosophy today, now this principle is being attacked. So it's complex. Nace's deep ecology is complex. It has come into a lot of criticism, but I won't go into details about the criticism, except one criticism which I'll come to towards the end of this talk about deep ecology. But deep ecology actually developed in the United States after this. It was developed by two people, Bill DeWall and George Sessions. They made major strides in publishing. In fact, the 73 essay of RNAs is included in a book on deep ecology by Bill DeWall and George Sessions. I've given it in the reference of the book. So, and later, this development of deep ecology was influenced by the Native American wisdom, the indigenous Red Indian wisdom, Zen Buddhism, Taoism, Gandhian thought was one of the influences, and some European pre-Socratic thinkers. Besides Spinoza, I'll come to Spinoza a little later. Spinoza was a Jewish person of Jewish origin, in fact, a Jewish fugitive. His parents were Jewish fugitives, settled down, I think, in Amsterdam. And he was a Jewish philosopher, but he sort of, I'll speak about him when I speak about environmental ethics, because he's a major, his work is very important in environmental ethics. Then the other influences on deep ecology were Thoreau and Aldous Ford, obviously. So it developed in the United States as a major branch of eco-philosophy. And in the US eco-critical canon, besides Thoreau, deep ecology also has a lot of influence, not just in eco-criticism only, but in environmental activism in the United States. Activist movements like Earth First were founded on deep ecological principles. And mind you, it's not all pacifist also. Deep ecological activist movements like Earth, they indulged in violent acts to fight against environmental destruction. There's one writer who had chained himself to a dam to prevent dam while it was being constructed, prevent the construction of the dam. And there had many violent attacks against environmental destruction. So even though they were motivated by deep ecological precepts, in their activism, they resorted to violent measures. Violent means, in a sense, it could be, it's not that they attacked somebody or something, but they violently resisted environmental destruction. And one of the major tenets of deep ecology was it refuted anthropocentrism. But Slavoj Zizek, who's European philosopher, very prominent contemporary philosopher, he has this to say about deep ecology. He says even deep ecology is anthropocentric because it's interesting to read Zizek. He says the paradox of deep ecology is that it's in its very rejection of anthropocentrism. It charges man with the duty of subordinating the narrow interests of the human species to the interests of all other forms of life and of the entire biosphere. Does it not thereby elevate man into a kind of, quotation, functionary of life? One can only ask of man to sacrifice his narrow interests and take into account the interests of the whole of life if one conceives of man as a universal being. So he says, Zizek says, Deep ecology, thus, is in no way can escape the charge of anthropology. Anyway, that is Zizek's view, and from people of left persuasion, and a lot of other critical views about deep ecology. From some of the points I mentioned earlier about some, conservative stereotypes being brought back into deep ecology. The second, of course, is environmental ethics. Environmental ethics, the main wellspring of environmental ethics, I would say, is the philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza lived in the 17th century, 1632 to 1677. His work on ethics, I mean, it's available in English. He virtually he derived his teachings from Jewish holy scriptures, Torah and Kabbalah, but he, in a sense, transformed the Jewish teachings from a kind of he moved it from a theistic inspiration to a kind of God as nature kind of view. Nature becoming God. That's the kind of transition he made in the Jewish thing, and the conventional Jewish priests were extremely upset with him. In fact, though they spoke about that wild young man, and they thought of even extending him from where he was living. So he faced his own problems, but Spinoza was rediscovered when environmental philosophy began growing in the 20th century. So Spinoza's ethics is God as nature. There is a certain amount of metaphysical determinism in his vision of nature, but his philosophy is much more complex, and it is not appropriate to reduce him to a mystic, a reformed Jew, or even he was influenced by Buddhist so it's not appropriate to reduce him even to a Buddhist kind of philosophical preacher. Then there is another strand of ethics, environmental ethics, you could call it, or you could say the prefigurative phase of another strand of environmental ethics, which came from the 19th century Russian philosopher Peter Kropotkin. Peter Kropotkin was from a princely family, from an aristocratic Russian royal family. His lifetime was 1842 to 1921. But he ran away from Russia and lived most of his life in England. Wrote many books, of course. But his ethics, his book on ethics is a major work. His concept of nature extended to the life of human societies. He did not just speak about nature only. He talked about the life of human societies, encompassing their economic, political, and moral problems. That's the difference Kropotkin brought to ethics. And he grounded human morality in an objective philosophy. That's the important part. Morals were an outcome of the social needs and habits of man, he said. Metaphysics is not the source of morals. That is what a key kind of difference between Spinoza and Kropotkin. In his classic work on ethics, he proclaimed, nature is thus to be recognized as the first ethical teacher of man. The social instinct innate in men, as well as in all the social animals. This is the origin of all ethical concepts and all subsequent development of morality. He believed in human survival based on a system of communal mutual aid. In fact, one of his books is titled Mutual Aid. I've given it in the reference. A kind of radical communalism. Don't confuse it with communism, because he was not a communist. Kropotkin was in fact, when all the movements for the Russian Revolution was happening in Russia, he was indifferent to it. So his was a kind of radical communalism, where people, you heard about the communes in Israel, for example. They're basically that kind of commune-based, a kind of rural. It's basically another form of rural life only, where you come together in communes and live a decentralized life based on local production, local employment, and things like that. So Kropotkin is another major philosopher in the environmental ethics tradition. Then, of course, there is the wilderness ethics, which can be traced to Thoreau and other wilderness philosophers in the American tradition. Then the modern times, the important landmarks in the development environmental ethics happened in the 70s again. In 1970s, two Australian philosophers began forefronting the philosophy of environment. In 74, John Passmore was one of the Australian philosophers. He published what is called Man's Responsibility to Nature. Again, given in the reference. He presented an impassioned exposition of the philosophical and ethical problems faced by humanity as they exploit and modify the world around. Another Australian, Peter Singer, it's a very famous book. Some of you must have read it. Peter Singer in 75 published a book called Animal Liberation. It is a major landmark, very widely read today. The focus was, of course, on animals. The way science and modern humans treat animals in the laboratories and in our kitchens also. I mean, you extend it across the board from laboratories to forests, to forests where you do hunting, then to your kitchens where you butcher animals for eating. So animal liberation by Singer was another major landmark in ethics. And in 79, there was a journal called Environmental Ethics was published in the United States by Eugene C. Hargrove. After this, there was a flood of writings on environmental ethics. It came into its own on as a kind of branch of ethics. Basically, environmental ethics also has another major influence behind it, which is called holism. In fact, holism is not, it's an all-pervading kind of philosophical tenet all through environmental philosophy, even in the socialistic tradition. Holism is there, but the interpretation of holism differs based on the tenets of each philosophical branch of economics. But holism as such, as a philosophical precept, was articulated by J.C. Smuts, the British philosopher, in 1926. He spoke about a plant or animal as a whole. We notice the fundamental holistic characteristics as a unity of parts, which is so close and intends to be more than a sum of its parts. That is, an organism, or nature, or a habitat, or you take a region like Kerala, for example. You cannot view it as this forest, this agriculture land, this water body, or this backwater. It's all these parts joined together, the sum of its parts, all conjoined to make the whole. That was the holistic vision of J.C. Smuts as he articulated it in 1926. And as I said, holism in different forms travels through ecological philosophy and is interpreted by various people depending on their political and social preferences. But however, environmental ethics is, you cannot call it as a complete philosophy, ecological philosophy, the way deep ecology for people who believe in deep ecology is, or the way ecofeminism for people who believe in it is as a philosophical system. That way, environmental ethics is a little limited branch of eco-philosophy. Now we come to, I think I've completed 1 hour. It'll take maybe another 15 minutes, try to stop, but we have enough time for questions. We come to ecofeminism. Ecofeminism, perhaps there have been some writings before my 2000 book, Kadhaim Paristhim, the short story and the environment. Before that, there have been some writings by some feminist activists in Kerala on ecofeminism. But ecofeminism was presented in literature, perhaps in my book, in that 2000 book, in a major way. In fact, I had a chapter where I wrote about feminist stories by men also. ecofeminist stories by men also. So there was a separate chapter on that. So ecofeminism is the origin can be traced to a 1974 essay by Francois Bon. Yeah, he's a French philosopher. She wrote first in French, because unfortunately, I think till 1994, the English translation is not available. So she was not known very much in the English world till Ruth Hotel translated it in 1994. But Francois was an interesting human being. She was a member of the French Communist Party for about 10 years. She moved away from the Communist Party. She established the Ecology Feminism Center in Paris. Then she started writing on these issues. And because I think I should mention about somebody else in the French tradition before Francois, who wrote about these things in her famous book, The Second Sex. I'm talking of Simone de Beauvoir, the companion of Jean-Paul Sartre. Simone de Beauvoir, in her 49 book, I think, Second Sex, was published in French in 49. The English translation was much later. She talked about the connection between the women and nature, not exactly the connection, but the way women and nature are exploited by the patriarchal. We talk about connection between women and nature. It's a dangerous thing because that can be used to exploit women more, because you can suppress nature and you can suppress women. So she talked about the patriarchal oppression of women, and so Beauvoir was a kind of first feminist writer to talk about it. Then later, of course, German Greer also wrote about it in some way later. But let's come back to Francois. In 74, her essay now is available in English, as I said. The basic tenets she talked about feminism, I will have to read out, unfortunately. She said ecofeminism is a new humanism, born with the irreversible end of the male society. Then she says, at the base of the ecological problem are found the structures of a certain power, that is a patriarchal power. The patriarchal system has been the bane of the planet ever since men arrogated to themselves the power to decide on the fertility of the soil and the fertility of women. Women, let us, not women. So the fertility of the soil and fertility of women were brought under patriarchal control. They decide, because the women have no say about when they should bear a child. The man decides depending on his desires. So that kind of system is a creation of the patriarchal society. So Francois views the capitalist system of profit as a creation of the phallocracy, and points out that even if the capitalist system is abolished, the patriarchy in the new system, even if it is socialist, the patriarchy continues. That's what she says. Because the patriarchy resists all revisions of the established patriarchal order. The phallocracy is at the base of an order which can only assassinate nature in the name of profit if it is a capitalist society, and in the name of progress if it is a socialist. This is how Francois, in brief, Francois' ecofeminist believes. Then again, as it happens that ecofeminism grew mostly in the United States. In 75, there was a major work on ecofeminism. Almost at the time Francois was writing in French, Rosemary Radford Ruther, major ecofeminist philosopher. She could be, if you want to place her in the ecofeminist canon, you could say she's a kind of ecofeminist theologist, or even ecofeminist liberation theologist, if you please. Rosemary Radford Ruther, in 75, she wrote a book called New Woman, New Earth, which became a canonical work in ecofeminism. As I said, it is a kind of ecofeminist theology she said in her book, women must see that there can be no liberation for them and no solution to the ecological crisis within a society whose fundamental model of relationships continues to be one of domination. They must unite the demands of the women's movement with those of the ecological movement to envision a radical reshaping of the basic socio-economic relations and the underlying values of this. See, this is a major, like Francois, she also stressed the reshaping of the socio-economic relations. This is absent in philosophies like DB. But this ecofeminists, major ecofeminists have been stressing this, the transmutation or reshaping of the socio-economic relations. Then in 76, the Institute of Social Ecology in Vermont, that is the place where Murray Bookchin used to live in the United States. Murray Bookchin, as all of you know, I'm not speaking about his philosophy. That is, he articulated a philosophy called social ecology, which didn't get much currency because it didn't get much acceptance. But there are many books by Murray Bookchin. They articulated a version of social ecofeminism, and a philosopher called Nesta King was major philosopher of social ecofeminism. And in 78, another major work, two major works came out. One was Guy in Ecology, an extremely interesting book, which anybody interested in ecofeminism should read, by Mary Daly, Guy-Ecology, or is a Guy in public ecology. It's kind of feminist, ecofeminist reading of the Bible. Basically, you could say it brought to fore, Mary, this is his mother, and the concept, the holy concept, that was brought to fore. And there are a lot of articles. You have to read the book. I cannot go into any detail about Mary Daly's vision here. Then the second book was Susan Griffin's Woman and Nature. These two authors were probably the progenitors of what is called a radical cultural ecofeminism. Another interesting book, and very influential book rather, published in 1980 was The Death of Nature by Caroline Marchant. Caroline Marchant could be called a left of center kind of ecofeminist. She's not exactly Marxist, but she could be called a left of center socialist kind of ecofeminist. So ecofeminism, basically, there are many strands within it. Tomorrow, I hope Dr. Dancy came to touch upon these many strands. I would only say that I've already spoken about radical cultural ecofeminism. I've spoken about ecofeminist theology. And you could speak about what is called spiritual ecofeminism. People like writers like Thorhoff, Merlin Stone, Dolores LaChapelle. So there are many writers who follow the spiritual ecofeminism branch of ecofeminism. And in fact, Dolores LaChapelle goes to the extent of connecting the spirituality with the women's sexual energy. Listen. She talks about the return of the female principle, which could be the focus of human unity and efforts to conserve it. And she goes one step further in conflating women's sensuality, sexual energy, and fertility as the basis for a new spirituality. So given the reference in the reference list, the reference of her book, it's a very big book, actually printed in big format. So then cultural feminists believe that gender relations became skewed in favor of men due to culturally constructed dominant patriarchal systems and power structures. That's what cultural ecofeminists believe, that it is due to culturally constructed dominant patriarchal systems and power structures that women's oppression happened. Women's and nature of oppression of nature at the same time. And women were culturally painted as weak and biologically superior to men. This argument was used to discriminate, exploit, subordinate, and oppress women through religious, legal, institutional, and when necessary, even violent means. Similar was the case with nature and all forms of life there. Not just women, the same tactics and the same institutional legal structures were used to suppress nature also, nature and other beings. So they believe that human relationships can be rebuilt, relationships with nature can be rebuilt simultaneously through women's liberation also, through political interventions and social changes. That, I mean, their version of social change is slightly different. Of course, they basically stress cultural changes. However, most traditional ecofeminists believe in the ethics of care. Care could be called regressive in a strictly feminist sense, because then the responsibility of domestic care, taking care of children, the elderly, could be put on women only. So that ethics of care has to be defined very carefully, so that the man can also take care of domestic work. The man can also take care of children. So the ethics of care has to be defined very carefully. So the ethics of care, interconnectedness, and cultural transformation. These are and most of the ecofeminist traditions are, we could say, mildly political. But there is one branch of ecofeminism which developed early, as I mentioned, 1980 itself, through through Carolyn Merchant. It's the socialist ecofeminist strand. It basically evolved, socialist ecofeminism basically evolved through movements for resistance movements which happened in developing countries, movements of women from the basic classes. This is basically in the developing world. What happened was environmental movements are basically about livelihood. It is not just about wilderness protection. Because in the West, what happens in the West is, because they have thrown out or finished off most of the native populations through genocide. In the West, the forests don't have forest dwellers. So they are simply wilderness areas without people, whereas our wilderness areas are actually inhabited by our indigenous populations. So our environmental struggles are against livelihood displacements, either by indigenous populations or when people's livelihoods are destroyed by destroying their river or their water systems of their local nature. Their land is acquired for a mega development project. So mostly in the developing world, environmental resistance has been for livelihood activities. So through this, in fact, environmental destruction in the developing world affects our women most, because culturally decided that patriarchal system has decided that women have to cook, women have to collect the firewood, women have to collect water from, those of you who live in Kerala probably don't know this, but those of us who have lived outside Kerala know how in other parts of India, especially in northern part of India, starting with Maharashtra. Maharashtra is not exactly northern India, but starting with Maharashtra in rural areas, the life of women are pretty bad because of these responsibilities imposed on them. And environmental destruction in the villages means they have to walk longer distances for collecting water, firewood, etc. So a subsistence kind of green feminism developed in the developing world, which was the basis for the socialist feminism. And you know about writers like Vandana Shiva from India. She, along with Maria Miles, have articulated their own version of ecofeminism, which is they called a subsistence feminism. So, so that's how. And socialist ecofeminism, however, developed in the West also. There are writers like Mary Miller, Ariel Selig, did a lot of theoretical work in, in foregrounding this socialist ecofeminism from a more and more Marxist perspective. And the latest is a philosopher called Pamela Oddi, who has completely gone to the other extreme to talk about Marxist ecofeminism. She sourced theoretical tenets within Marxism to talk about Marxist ecofeminism, because Marxism itself has been redefined. I mean, the 20th century Marxism, as it prevailed in Soviet Russia or in some of the other countries, or as it prevails today in China, have been refuted by new interpretations of Marxist thinking and the environmental vision in Marxism. Marx as a kind of environmental philosopher. In fact, I have a huge collection of these eco-socialist works published all over the world, and there's a huge literature on eco-socialism today in the world, and it's a major brand. And it as part of the political movements, there have been many political parties that sprung up around the world based on, they're not exactly green parties, but green socialist parties. Many of them sprung up around the world based on eco-socialist visions. They refute the conventional socialist traditions as it is being practiced in Soviet Russia or being practiced in China now. Soviet Russia actually had a very strong green socialist tradition in the 20s and 30s, but with the ascendancy of Stalin, all that was suppressed. Now I come to the last part of my talk. I have finished now 75 minutes. I'll take about 5-6 more minutes. My allotted time is 90. I'll take about 5-6 more minutes to talk about eco-socialism or ecological Marxism. See, I just want to say a little bit about Marx's background. His thesis was, his PhD thesis was called The Difference Between Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature. Epicurus was a major philosopher, of course, we cannot call him a logical philosopher, but he talked about nature in a major way. And this kind of follower, Lucretius, is a poet, wrote a major thesis, I mean, a long poem, based on Epicurean philosophy. So Marx's PhD thesis was on Epicurus's philosophy. So his beginning was about thinking about nature. Then he critiqued Hegel's view of nature. In fact, we say he made Hegel's philosophy of nature stand on its head. Because Hegel said nature intervenes in history directly. That was, to put in one sentence, that was Hegel's philosophy of nature. Nature influences history directly. Whereas Marx said nature influences history through the medium of human production, human metabolism with nature. Because humans are the agents who transform nature. Nature changes history maybe once in a blue moon, natural events like, volcanic eruptions or cyclonic eruptions or whatever. But the persistent phenomena in nature is human interaction with nature, human production, let us say, for survival in different ways. In agricultural days, we used to produce agricultural products. Even industrialization came, we started mass production of commodities, and we started mining the earth in a big way, taking out resources, fossil fuels, and metals and minerals in a very big way. It just landed up in today's soup. Anyway, so Marx's philosophy basically was grounded on the fact that it is through production that humans alter nature. And in fact, his first writing as a journalist in his province in Prussia, Prussia's previous Germany, part of Rhineland was his province in Prussia, part of current today's Germany. He was editor of a magazine newspaper called Rheinisches Zeitung, I don't know whether my pronunciation is correct. It's a German word. He first joined as a journalist and was elevated as editor in a few months' time. Then there was a law passed in the Rhineland Assembly. I mean, law came for discussion, making the collection of dried wood twigs and this thing from private forests by farmers. It was their right traditionally to collect dried wood and dried twigs and all. So this was, they wanted to criminalize this and brought a law for criminalizing this traditional rights of farmers. So Mars wrote against this law in the initial a series of 5 articles. It's available on internet even today. I've given the reference there, I think. So that's how he started his career. So when he articulated his philosophy, also this influence was very much behind his philosophy. Only thing is, it was discovered much late. Actually, in the 70s, authors, left-thinkers started discovering this side of Marx. The first book probably was Alfred Schmidt's The Concept of Nature in Mars. It came out in German in 1962. The same year, Silent Spring was published by Rachel Carson. But the concept of nature in Mars was it promoted kind of a Promethean kind of Martian vision. So it was not accepted by eco-socialists later. The real book which became important in the 70s, published in the 70s, was Mars and Engels and Ecology by Howard Parsons. That was a real articulation of Marxist thinking on the environment. In fact, it has extracts from Marx's works, hundreds of, more than 100 pages of extract from Marx's works included in this book, published in 77 by Howard Parsons. Well, then let's, because of time constraints, I want to move fast. So, but eco-socialism as a distinct philosophy started developing in the 1980s. There was a journal called Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, which began publication in the United States from New York. And the founding editor, James O'Connor, he was one of the major initial philosophers of eco-socialism. He came up with a philosophy called, with a paper called Second Contradiction of Capitalism. I have to then tell you what is the first contradiction. In Marxism, the first contradiction is the contradiction between the owners of capital and the workers. That's the first contradiction, which may result, according to that part of the Marxian concept, this contradiction may result in conflict and may lead to a takeover by the proletarians. That's the first contradiction, because the capitalists, the owners of capital, appropriate the benefits of production by the workers, and hence the conflict happens. This is the first contradiction. The second contradiction which James O'Connor talked about was the conflict between production and the conditions of production. The conditions of production, one of the major aspects of conditions of production defined by Marx is the raw materials we extract from nature, which is the reason for, one of the major reasons for environmental destruction. So the conflict between the process of production or even capital itself and the conditions of production, especially the resources. Basically, it means when the resources dwindle, when the resources deplete, the process of production itself reaches a crisis. And hence, capitalism reaches a crisis, a flashpoint. In fact, this century, before 2050, we are going to see this flashpoint happening because of depletion of resources like oil, like many of the metals, like, we are all using these smartphones. I'm speaking through my tablet to you. All these devices are made by very, very rare metals and minerals, which apparently because of hundreds of studies which I have seen of these resources, which say that they are not going to last for a long time. In fact, my new book recently published by KSSP, all these detailed articulations of these issues are there. I've told Dr. Hebar about my new book. It contains a detailed analysis of this source crisis, coming crisis. It is based on about 800 references, scientific references, most of them published scientific studies published in the 21st century. My book is based on that. It's a big book, 400 pages text and about 42 pages reference. It's available online also from Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad. I am probably going to do that book in English. I'm writing slightly differently. So this became a critical issue, the second contradiction of capitalism. So that was one of the first strands of socialism. Then around the beginning of the 21st century, two major works came, which was a departure from the previous eco-socialist tendency. This was by two writers. One is called Paul Burkett, and the other is John Bellamy Foster. Paul Burkett and John Bellamy Foster, basically they talked about, especially Foster, talked about the theory of metabolic rift. Marx has talked about a rift between humans and their sources of life, because he said when urbanization happens because of capitalist growth, urbanization happens, people congregate in the urban areas for jobs and all. Then from the rural areas, food and clothing, everything comes from the rural areas. But the waste materials of, say, example, the food waste and the vegetable waste, everything, it should ideally go back to the soil to replenish the soil. It doesn't go back to the soil because you dump it in the urban, waste, wherever you deposit the waste. So there is a rift happening. That's what Marx has spoken about. And there are so many. I mean, this rift concept is a major concept being articulated in a very big way. I cannot go into the detail. So the metabolic rift between humans and nature is another major tenet of eco-socialism, developed, put forth by John Bellamy Foster. There are at least 6-7 major works by Bellamy Foster published till now. So, and he, in fact, there are, if you say that eco-socialism has gone through, let's say, 4 distinct phases. There is a prefigurative phase in the 60s and 70s when writers started talking about Marxism and nature. In the 80s, it started developing, growing into, that's called the first stage of eco-socialism. The major tenet in the first stage was the second contradiction of capitalism, which I spoke about. The second stage of eco-socialism starts with John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett, especially the theory of metabolic rift. And the third stage, of course, is now happening where, let's say, eco-socialism, where people are now studying the waste, the praxis, as they say in Marxist terminology. They are looking at praxis, how to practice this theory, how to put these ecological, eco-socialist precepts into practice. That is moving away from the Soviet way or the Chinese way. How can you put this into practice in a modern democratic system? It's in fact a complete rewriting of old Marxist precepts. In fact, Marx never said so many things which were propagated in the name of Marx by left intellectuals in Soviet Russia or Europe or in China. So a complete rewriting of Marxian thinking is happening, and there's a third stage of eco-socialism now happening, and trying to look at praxis, how to practice these eco-socialism, put them into practice in various stages, in day-to-day life, in governance, in various spheres, in any field of human activity, starting from agriculture to industry, how we can change it in a eco-friendly, eco-socialist way. So this is how the major difference of between other eco-philosophy and eco-socialism is that eco-socialism forefronts production, the system of production, the way we produce as the major reason for the crisis. It also holds capitalism as responsible for the crisis we are facing. As I said, those of us who study climate change very seriously know that it is about 90 multinational corporations who are responsible for today's climate crisis, even though it is attributed to population, it is attributed to the poor countries, uh, uh, inappropriately so. It's these corporations who have tried to debunk the existence of a phenomenon called climate change. They have spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars from 1980s onwards. They continue to do so. In fact, I have quoted in my book briefly about how ExxonMobil, the oil companies, even today, when disasters are happening all over the country, ExxonMobil is spending hundreds of billions of dollars to deny that there is anything like climate change exists. And Mr. Trump, Donald Trump was a manifestation of that denial industry. He was a manifestation. Unfortunately, he was removed by American people from power. But he was a very clear manifestation because most of his, even the head of the American Environmental Protection Agency was an oil company man during Trump's time. So that's the kind of thing. So there is some truth in the fact that it is capitalist production and the unfettered search for profit which has landed us in today's crisis. And the people who believe in this version of eco-philosophy believe that a change can, we don't need incremental change. Nothing can be achieved through incremental change. We can make changes only through system change. In fact, there is a slogan called system change, not climate change. Well, that's not our today's subject, but this is what eco-socialism is about. I have written about eco-socialism in my collection of essays published by Kairali Buskanur, my selected essays published by Kairali Buskanur. My next book may be a detailed for eco-socialism, the theoretical aspects and the praxis. So I conclude here just by saying that eco-philosophy, wherever you stand with ecology, you stand with ecofeminism, you are a conservationist, you are a preservationist, or you are a eco-socialist. The fact is today it is an all-pervading philosophy which has influenced literature in a major way. In fact, the only branch of literary criticism which is growing very fast today is eco-criticism. It has influenced all branches of knowledge, starting from psychology to sociology, you name it, anthropology. Eco-philosophy has influenced all these branches of knowledge, and it's a major influence. You won't see it in day-to-day life. I'm basically talking about the intellectual world. Day-to-day life is time that it influences day-to-day life. Thank you very much.